Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you for asking me this evening. Thank you to those of you who are here in person, which is the first time I've done one of these for a while, and hello to everyone watching this online as well. So I'd like to begin with a comment about the title of the book, Peter Moro and Partners. The "and Partners" is very deliberate. Peter Moro was the undisputed nucleus around which the projects that I'm going to discuss this evening were all centred, and his role was absolutely critical. But at the same time, many of these projects were delivered collaboratively. His colleagues in practice made important contributions, as did specialist consultants and often also his clients. Now, my account of Moro's work is rooted in the archive. There is no single archive of Moro's work, but rather a series of disparate collections in different places. The fact that much of Moro's work was for public sector clients means that a reasonable amount of material survives, and that shapes the story that I'm able to tell. It's one of largely built projects and of architecture as process as much as creative act. Now, as you can see here, the archive also gives some clues as to Moro's view of historians and critics. I found a number of quotations as I worked my way through the archive, which suggested a slightly dim view of historians. This placard was apparently displayed in Moro's office, and I hope my judgments, both in the book and tonight, are not what Moro would have considered the presumptuous opinions of the ignorant. So let's begin with this image, and it shows a screen in the Mars Group's 1938 exhibition of modern architecture in London. Mars, as many of you will know, was a progressive grouping which brought together many of the leading lights in late 1930s design in Britain. This particular screen was designed by Peter Moro and Gordon Cullen. Cullen, of course, would go on to be known for his post-war townscape philosophy. The screen adopts the tripartite definition of good architecture put forward by Vitruvius and as translated in the Renaissance by Henry Wood. Commodity or functionality, firmness, structural rigour, and delight. Now, in using these terms, Moro and Cullen very deliberately situate the modernist project within a longer architectural continuity, perhaps legitimizing the modernist project within architectural history. But these qualities of commodity, firmness, and delight, as we will see this evening, also mattered to Moro. In this respect, the essential message of this talk, and indeed the book, is that Moro and his colleagues sought an enriched modernism. Moro was acutely aware that functional adequacy alone did not make for good architecture. Massing, materials, the ways that spaces were experienced, all these things were important too. Moro's line of thinking in this respect echoes themes laid down by the modernist designer Berthold Lubetkin in the 1930s. As we will see, there is a connection between Moro and Lubetkin, which explains that continuity of thought. And it's a line of thought which animates Moro's work and that of his practice right through into the early 1980s. Here we see Peter Moro in the late 1940s sitting on a perspex chair of his own designing, produced for ICI in order to demonstrate the possibilities of this material, and apparently not all that comfortable. Sadly, it appears not to survive. Moro was born in 1911 in Heidelberg in Germany. His father was a well-known doctor, after whom the Moro reflex, demonstrated by newborn babies, was named. The young Peter Moro excelled at art, but his father suggested that he should become an architect in order to put his talents to practical use. Peter Moro therefore studied in Stuttgart and then Berlin, before the discovery that his grandmother had been born into the Jewish faith meant that he was expelled from his studies. He moved to the ETH in Zurich before arriving in London in 1936. Moro had hoped to work with Walter Gropius, who was then based in London, and indeed he had an introduction to Gropius. But Gropius said that he had no vacancies. Fortuitously, Moro bumped into a friend from his Zurich days who was working with Berthold Lubetkin. And Moro was then taken on by Lubetkin's practice, Tecton, with Lubetkin fabricating a story that Moro was a world-renowned expert in staircase design in order to get him a work permit from the Home Office. Moro was particularly closely involved with the design of the High Point 2 flats in North London. The block was a companion to Tecton's first High Point building, and you see here on the slide the first High Point building behind the tree on the right of the image, High Point 2 coming towards us on the left. The difference in the elevational treatment of these two blocks demonstrates the ways in which Tecton's approach was evolving in the mid-1930s. The first High Point block is noted for its smooth rendered surfaces, whereas High Point 2 mixes different finishes, including brick and glass block, and the surface steps backward and forward. It delights in a greater complexity, a greater sense of contrast both inside and out. And it also embodies the way in which Tecton's search for an enriched modernism went beyond many of their contemporaries. As you see here, the canopy at the entrance to High Point 2 was infamously held up by plaster cast human figures, or caryatids, a deliberately historicist gesture, so it seemed to many of Lubetkin's colleagues, who were enraged by this apparently arbitrary borrowing. For Lubetkin, the caryatids were garden ornaments, and gardens had long been a place for architectural experiment. They also embodied the idea of a human architecture at the entrance to this building. Above them, the original High Point signage there was designed by Peter Moro, reviving a Victorian typeface. Sadly, that signage has since been altered. And that was one of many aspects of High Point 2 on which Moro worked. In the process, he learnt about feet and inches, improving his English when his colleague William Tatton Brown would hand him the telephone and walk out of the room, expecting Moro to deal with whoever was on the other end of the line. Moro worked on the lifts and the curved stairs in the duplex flats, each of which was to be slightly different. Looking back, Moro recalled that he had learnt more from this period working with Lubetkin and Tecton than in all his years of architectural study. He said, and I quote, "It was Lubetkin who first opened my eyes to the real meaning of architecture, an art based on a reason." Here then is that combination of commodity, firmness, and delight that we have already noted. And it was during this period that Moro became involved in the Mars Group, developing his professional connections and networks. Then, in 1938, he left Tecton and moved into independent practice, forming a partnership with Richard Llewellyn-Davies. Llewellyn-Davies would go on to become a prominent post-war architect. But in the late 1930s, at the time that he met Peter Moro, he was a student at the Architectural Association. The pair shared a flat. One day, Davies returned home from the AA and he reported that he had bumped into a woman who was looking for an architect to design a house for her. Davies suggested that the woman appeared to think that the Architectural Association was some sort of labour exchange for architects. And he said, "Well, I'm just a student." "Oh," said Moro, slightly irritated, "you could have told her about me. I'm fully qualified." Well, Davies and Moro together went to meet the woman, Pauline Tors, and her husband, George, a wealthy industrialist. And they went through a list of possible designers for the house which the Tors family wished to commission, gradually striking each one of them off before tentatively putting themselves forward. And they were taken on, and the result was the house you see here, Harbour Meadow at Birdham on the Sussex coast, completed in 1940. It was very much the brainchild of Mrs. Tors, who had a keen interest in design and was very much involved in the process of commissioning and furnishing the building. It forms an important bridge between Moro's work with Tecton and his later career. As you can see here, it consists of two parallel wings connected by a staircase. And I've highlighted them in orange to show you those two wings. One to the rear of the site contains the main living rooms with the master bedroom suite above. The other at the front of the site, the service areas and other bedrooms. Connecting them, a hall and another curved staircase, very much like those ones at High Point 2. There's a logical clarity about this plan, separating out the different functions of the house and giving each of them its own place in these distinctive volumes. A kind of logical clarity which would recur in numerous Moro projects. The approach to the house is deliberately asymmetric or non-axial. As these blue arrows show, you approach the house through the trees. Perhaps get out of the car and your chauffeur takes it away to that triple garage over there on the left, and you enter a courtyard, which you cross and then have to turn to the right into the hall. And here you have to turn again if you wish to reach the main living rooms, turning to the left. So there is a clear sequence: driveway, courtyard, glazed hall, living rooms. This lack of symmetry, these turns, this all echoes the entrance hall in the first High Point block by Tecton. Now, this is not a block that Moro had worked on. It predates his time with Tecton, but he would have known it very well. And he later wrote to Lubetkin of his particular liking for this space, the way that, again, you make various turns, the level changes, the ceiling height changes. There is this unfolding sequence of spaces. How much more interesting, he said, this sequence was at High Point than what he thought a boring axial approach might have been as an alternative. So here we see the entrance to Harbour Meadow. On the left there, that entrance courtyard accessed through this concrete frame, almost like the proscenium arch of the theatres for which Moro would later become well known. Notice also the contrasting textures of the rubble stone wall. Rising above it, the smooth brick of the main part of the house. And all of this also contrasting with the concrete frames to the windows, the concrete cornice at the top of the building. There is an enjoyment of contrasting textures here. There is also a deliberate ambiguity. It's almost as if the house has taken over a pre-existing stone wall, growing up behind it, perhaps even thrusting its way through it. Notice the way that the window on the right-hand side of my left-hand image pushes through that concrete frame, contrasting with the rubble stone. It is then an elevation made up of a series of layers, giving a sense of depth, amplified by the projecting roofline, which casts a shadow at the top of the building, as well as the dark shadow gap at the base of the building. A shadow gap in that place being a classic Tecton motif. The garden front is similarly complex and indeed similarly layered. It's asymmetric, giving the impression of a smooth brick box, which has been cut into as if with a scalpel to create that recessed section with the terrace at garden level and the balcony above it. The dark brickwork of the recessed section adds further to the sense of depth. And we then have a glazed bay window projecting forward, adding to that idea of 3 dimensions. Now, this is quite different from the kind of patterned tiling which Lubetkin and Tecton favoured at this time. But it gives the same sense of building as 3-dimensional abstract composition. Inside, changes in materials, changes in levels are used to denote different areas. Notice here in the living room, for example, the way in which the ceiling drops down and is ribbed above the seating area to create a distinctive space within a space, defined further with that timber-clad column on the left-hand side, which we'll see shortly echoed in much larger form at the festival hall. Now, Harbour Meadow was extensively covered in the press on its completion in 1940. No doubt further houses would have followed for Moro had the war not intervened. But Moro himself was interned briefly as an apparent enemy alien. On release, his career took two parallel paths. First, he became a well-regarded tutor at the Regent Street Polytechnic School of Architecture, where he had an immediate impact. Trevor Dannett was one of those first students taught by Moro, 1941-42, and Dannett recalled the respect that the students had for Moro on account of Harbour Meadow. Dannett noted the immediate impact which Moro had on the students' work. He didn't tolerate any sloppiness. He demanded the same rigor in terms of plan, section, and detailing as was apparent in his own work. Alongside his teaching, Moro also worked with designers such as Misha Black and Robin Day on propaganda exhibitions and commercial exhibitions. This was a productive sphere of work which occupied Moro and Day right through to the end of the 1940s. These exhibitions taught Moro much about how atmosphere and meaning can be created on a shoestring, through the ways in which people move through space, through the ways in which spaces are lit and furnished. Notice here, for example, the way in which the display panels on the right-hand side of the image echo the form of aeroplane wings, appropriate enough for the Jet exhibition of 1946. And notice too the way in which part of them has been angled to create a view obliquely through the space, leading you through without signage or other more overtly directional features. Notice too the pattern of light and shadow. What we have then is the control of views, the control of space, the control of lighting, all themes which we'll see later on in Moro's theatres. At the end of the 1940s, after nearly a decade of teaching and exhibition work, Moro's career took a new turn. In 1948, he was invited to take a leading role in the design team working on the Royal Festival Hall in London. Located on the south bank of the River Thames, the Festival Hall was to be a key element of the 1951 Festival of Britain. It was planned from 1947 onwards by the London County Council's chief architect, Robert Matthew, inspired by the design of recent arts buildings in Scandinavia. Having generated the initial concept, Matthew handed over the delivery and the execution of the project to his newly appointed deputy, Leslie Martin. Peter Moro was brought in as a so-called associated architect to work particularly on the interiors. Here you see the lead designers, including Matthew, Martin, and on the right, Edwin Williams, an experienced LCC designer who played a key role on the practical side. Now you should note Moro's position on the left-hand side of this photo. Moro had something of a sense of humor, and this comes through if you read his writing or listen to his British Library architect's interview. And reflecting on this photograph, he said, it's always best if you're in a group to stand on the right-hand side of the group facing the camera, because this means when the caption gets written, your name will be first in the list. Now, the Festival Hall building, as completed in 1951, was originally smaller than it is now, and it also looked a little different. The rear of the building was clad in asbestos. There was plans to build a second, smaller concert hall on that site, but there wasn't the time or the materials to do that before 1951, so a temporary rear elevation was constructed. The other sides of the building also don't look like the Festival Hall as we know it now. It was reclad and extended towards the river in the middle of the 1960s. What we see in 1951 is something arguably more complex than the 1960s refacing. We have a complex glazing pattern, particularly that diagonal patterning of the escape stairs that you see on the side elevation, but also this mixture of stone, different sorts of glazing, and indeed tecton-like patterned tiling on the side elevation. There's a sort of delicious complexity about this that I rather like. Inside, Moro worked with a hand-picked team of his former students. He joked that he had taught all of them and brainwashed them so that they all shared his approach and would not argue with him. Indeed, there wasn't time for arguments. The architects were hard at work, 1948, 49, 50. The building had to be ready for the festival in 1951. The public space was treated as a continuous foyer flowing around the solid object of the main concert hall itself. Glass screens, such as you see here on the right, and big windows allowed views into the building and through it. The different parts of the building were clearly on display inside and out. The axonometric here allows us to see the key concept of the festival hall, namely the idea of the egg in a box, a solid auditorium articulated as a distinctive mass within the core of the building. This arrangement was largely down to Robert Matthew, so Miles Glendinning has argued, and it makes best use of the compact site. It also serves to shield the hall from the noise and the vibrations of the adjacent railway lines. Now notice the way on the axo that the entrance is deliberately to one side. Now that's the main entrance. There were entrances on the other elevations as well, but that entrance on the left was conceived as the main entrance, deliberately subverting the symmetry or the axiality you might associate with older public buildings. As you come in, and as you see there on the right, there is a broad stair offering you a diagonal view up into the foyers. The short flight of stairs leads to the cloakroom level, where you might check in your coat. Alternatively, you can continue up into the main foyer. But the point, once again, is that you turn as you move through the building. This is not a simple processional route that gives everything away in the first glimpse. As you arrive in the foyer, the auditorium rake, the egg in the box, is visible above your head. Indeed, fluorescent lighting was used to emphasize it. One of the first uses of this sort of lighting for emphasis in Britain. The space is broken up through the use of different materials, both on the floor and on the ceiling, as well as different kinds of lighting. Colors, finishes were used to code the different parts of the structure consistently and rigorously. As you move through the building, a greater sense of symmetry emerges, reflecting the symmetrical design of the hall itself. And you can again see those views through the space, the use of glazed screens particularly, and these minimal balustrades, all intended to create these views through, but also to put the gathering audience itself on display. The idea of a peopled space very much to the fore here. Bespoke patterned carpets were produced, the pattern known as net and ball. Moro came up with the wavy line, the net, which we might liken to a visual representation of sound waves, a kind of scientific pattern here, echoing the work of the Festival Pattern Group elsewhere in the Festival of Britain. The ball was added by Leslie Martin, apparently inspired by an apple on his desk. And throughout the building, bespoke furniture was produced by the likes of Robin Day. The auditorium itself is a rectangular hall with a single gallery. Its modulated wall and ceiling surfaces to some extent disguise this rectangular shoebox form, which was preferred on acoustic grounds to a fan-shaped plan. Along both the side walls, these curved boxes were required by the acousticians to break up the surface. They're angled towards the stage, a demonstration perhaps of functionality. Their curved fronts recalling the balconies of Tecton's first high point flats. The atmosphere deliberately warm and rich with dark colours, elm and walnut panels and red leather, and red woolen fabric patterns, hangings with a pattern designed by Sadie Speight. Now, the significance of the festival hall cannot be overstated. In 1951, this was the first major non-austerity building to be completed in post-war Britain. The first major arts building to be built since before the Second World War. It offered a new model of public architecture, financed by public money, designed by architects in the public service working for the London County Council. A building which embraced its users rather than dominating them. Traditional perhaps in the idea that its high cultural offerings were of innate value, perhaps paternalistic in seeking to encourage an appreciation of that culture, but reflective of a new egalitarian approach, suggesting new models of democratic citizenship and participation. And for Moro, it was a key step in his career. He returned on the completion of the festival hall to independent practice. In the early 1950s, he was occupied by two main projects. The first was the creation of television studios for London's ITV contractor, Associated Rediffusion, on the Kingsway in London, a job which had to be completed in a short space of time, like the festival hall, and which was similarly technical. The other main job of the early 50s was the school you see here, Fairlawn School in Lewisham, built for the London County Council, no doubt reflecting contacts that Moro had made while he was working on the festival hall. A steeply sloping site. Moro suggested this is why the LCC didn't want to design a school here itself. It was difficult, so they gave it to him as an outsider, an external practice to do. And here Moro was assisted by a new recruit, Michael Mellish, who joined him from Dennis Lasden's practice and remained working with Moro into the 1980s. Like Harbour Meadow, it's broken down into its component parts. On the left of the image, the lowest part of the site, we have the 4 infants' classrooms, each clearly articulated. Then in the middle of the image, we see the end wall of the school hall receding away from us. And then at right angles to that, at the top of the site, the glazed curtain wall of the junior block. In essence then, the school as a clear assemblage of different volumes or elements, almost a kind of architectural equivalent of the art inside it by Victor Passmore, which you see there on the left-hand side. There's a crispness, a clarity about the detailing. It's clear what's structure, what's infill. As in the festival hall, different elements were consistently color-coded. But at the same time, human interest was important too. Color was used in the infants' corridor to identify the classrooms to these smallest of the children. Meanwhile, the journey across the site forms a sort of architectural promenade, again, like the journey through Harbour Meadow or the festival hall. As you arrive at the school and move across the site and into the building, you climb ramps and steps. The upward route continues through the building, up that stair you see on the right to reach the junior school. In essence, that school is a simpler version of the curved staircases of the High Point duplexes, but it similarly ennobles the experience of moving through the school. Further school commissions followed for Moro and his colleagues, notably Highcliffe School on the edge of Leicester, which was completed in 1964. As in Lewisham, we have a disaggregated plan, typical of the early 1960s, in that the classrooms are clustered around the larger volume of the hall. The plan suggests a school community made up of a series of discrete but related class units, each housed in these octagonal spaces. And octagons became very much a favoured form for Moro and his colleagues during the 1960s and 70s. They give the design, though, this important consistency, suggesting the whole community, but also showing its constituent parts, addressing contemporary ideas, perhaps, of cluster and association, such as were permeating through Team 10 discourse. How could the individual find themselves within the wider community? Not least on this building, showrooms and offices for the Hilly Company on Albemarle Street in London's West End, completed in 1963. The Hilly Company had been founded as a manufacturer of furnishings early in the 20th century, and after the Second World War turned increasingly to modern design, with Robin Day becoming one of its key designers. Robin Day encouraged Hilly to modernize its entire identity. For example, producing a new logo for them with a stylish lowercase typeface. And Day also worked on their publicity material. The idea was a modern image which would complement the furnishing that Hilly was making and selling. And this building was intended as an integral component of that image. A slender tower facing Albemarle Street, stretching back with a lower block behind. Concrete frame, curtain wall glazing again, like the juniors block at Fairlawn School. If you look at the left-hand photo, look at the upper stories of the glazing. The emphasis placed on the vertical mullions is just about evident in that image, emphasizing the verticality of the building and floating above the large sheets of glass of the shop front on the lower two levels. This move was in fact entirely logical, denoting the way in which the curtain walling is hung from the top of the building. Although the Architects' Journal thought it very peculiar, Moro responded with a drawing which showed the building turned on its head and thanked the Architects' Journal for their free design advice, as he put it. But once again, there is this relationship between delight and logic, particularly that stair on the right-hand side with which Robin Day was particularly involved. The wires hung from the ceiling, putting the engineering on view to dramatic effect. In essence, the Hilly building is a considered interpretation of a type of building becoming increasingly common in post-war Britain, namely the glazed office tower. And something of that is also evident in this next project. This is Peter Moro's own home at 20 Blackheath Park in southeast London, completed in 1957. It similarly takes what might be thought of as a fairly ordinary idea, the family house, and tries to do something special with it. Moro certainly described it using terms such as ordinary and modest. And in some ways, this is true. It uses brick, tile, and timber. And yet there's also a sophistication about the way in which space is handled and the ways in which the materials are used. Here we see the model. And what I want you to note here is the way in which the house has two stories. But each of those is actually broken in two to create four levels rising through the site. This allows for a full width clear story at the upper level running across the width of the house. The main living areas, the bedrooms, are upstairs with service spaces and a garage below, an arrangement which allowed for privacy but also gave good views of the gardens. Facing the street, as at Harbour Meadow, we have a layered elevation cut into and varied using different materials, colours, and textures to create a sense of depth. The front door, is one of my favourite details. Notice the way, just about make it out in the black and white image there on the right, the way in which the dark band with the letterbox and the number of the house cuts across the window and then continues across the door. This interplay of shapes and forms once more now taken from plan and section through into the details. And I particularly like the big letterbox, all the better for architectural drawings and magazines. On the garden front, the way in which the upper level appears to float over the ground floor echoes some of the interwar villas of Le Corbusier, but the combination of timber cladding, painted brick creates a more diverse and organic feeling, akin to the way in which, of course, Le Corbusier's work had developed by the Second World War. Inside, the front door gives on to a long stair, which leads up to the upper landing and then the living room. The house's distinguishing feature was its open planning, much remarked on at the time. There are shades here of that transparency, that openness of the festival hall, now domesticized perhaps. Steps continue up from the sitting area to the dining area and kitchen. And there are views through into Moro's study. If you look on the image on the left, you can see the fireplace set between those two white painted brick columns. Views through the fire, views around the chimney, and of course views to either side. Originally, there was a dividing unit to the left of the fireplace running towards the window, but even then there were views above that. So the idea of connected space, really important here. Moro's achievement at Blackheath Park was a comfortable home, which feels familiar, but nonetheless suggests new ways of living, evoking, humanizing the spirit of earlier modernist villas and transcending the contemporary fashions of the mid-50s through its appeal to the fundamentals of space and materials. Council housing came increasingly to form an important part of the practice's workload during the 60s and 70s. Its first major scheme was in the East End of London, to the north of Cable Street, where an area of poor quality housing was swept away and replaced by a pair of quadrangles either side of what's now the Docklands Light Railway. These quadrangles were formed from low-rise blocks of maisonettes with a vertical accent provided by a single tower block. And within those quadrangles, a pedestrian deck with play areas. This scheme, Thurza Street Barnardo Gardens, was for what became the Greater London Council. And this led on to other relatively modest schemes for the GLC in the late 60s and 70s in such places as Tooting and Wandsworth. But more complex were the projects which the practice designed for the newly formed London Borough of Southwark. Moro's practice came to the attention of Felix Trenton, the borough architect, because of the Thurza Street development. Its first job for Southwark was the project you see here, a modest piece of infill in Montpellier Road, Peckham, 1969 to 74. A project which Charles McKean and Tom Jestico suggested in 1976 in their review of recent London architecture, combined well-chosen materials and careful detailing to make what they said was a very small stairway into a pleasant space, contextual, but without being imitative. Subsequent jobs, though, were rather larger in scale and more complex in their layout, reflecting the way in which Southwark in the late 60s and 70s turned away from the mixed development characteristic of 1950s London. That mixed development of the 1950s brought together a range of different housing types. Southwark, however, increasingly embraced the idea of high-density, low-rise design, similar in some ways to what was being done in Camden around this same period, but less well known in many ways than the projects designed and built in Camden. The idea was to achieve high population densities without having tall buildings. And this was to be achieved through buildings of often complex section. Here we have Hamilton Square of 1973, with two ranges of buildings, each of which was split into two by an open walkway. Within each of those ranges of buildings, a mixture of different flat types, some of them crossing over from one side of the walkway to the other, and each given its own outdoor terrace or garden. The spatial gymnastics of Hamilton Square reappear in other Moro and Partners projects for Southwark during the 70s and early 80s, such as here Pomeroy Street or Queen's Road in Peckham, completed in 1982. The idea very much to reinterpret the scale, the sense of association of the traditional London street, with each home having its own identifiable entrance, the walkways providing space for neighbourly chat, and indeed, as you see there on the right, plant pots. By the early 80s, Moro and his colleagues were recognised for this work by their peers, but the severe reduction in council house construction after the 1979 election sadly put paid to this very productive line of development. Now, one of the messages of the book is the diversity of the projects with which Moro and his colleagues were involved. And I argue that that diversity deserves to be better known. But it's for their theatres that they were best known, and it's with these buildings that I'm going to end tonight. Again, the festival hall was key. Moro's work on the festival hall established him as a specialist in arts buildings at a time when there were very few people who could lay claim to that label. Between the mid-50s and the early 80s, Moro's practice designed more new theatres in Britain than anyone else. Moro's expertise in theatre design also found outlets in writing, committee membership, and participation in professional networks. The first of these theatres was Nottingham Playhouse, commissioned 1956, opened in 1963, one of the wave of new regional theatres built in post-war Britain, supported with public subsidy, a subject that I've explored in more detail in my other book, Modern Playhouses. Nottingham Playhouse was quickly recognised at the time and subsequently as one of the very best of these new theatres. If we look here at the building, we can again see its geometric clarity. The auditorium, a concrete drum rising through and above the foyers. A play of solidity and transparency, akin to the festival hall, particularly at the lower level, where, as you can see, the elevation is completely glazed. The main stair rising diagonally behind it is completely on view. The movement of people up and down that stair was very carefully considered and understood as an integral part of your view of this building. But there's also an ambiguity about it. The early drawings, such as you see on the left, show the upper level as a long Corbusian slot. But as built, we have a more complex pattern of square glazing and narrow vertical slots. The horizontal slots, the horizontal line is sort of still there, but its rhythm becomes complicated. The result gives us framed glimpses of the movement, the colour of the gathering audience, giving us a glimpse of what's there rather than revealing everything. Inside, the foyers again conceived as a backdrop to the gathering audience, the stair cutting through the upper foyer conceived as a gallery. This is a space which, like so many of the theatres in this period, wants to have people inside it. And the board-marked concrete walls understood as a surface with a degree of interest in itself, but also as a backdrop to that audience. Much the same can be said of the auditorium, which contemporary reviewers felt to be really theatrical, despite its lack of gilded cherubs or conventional theatrical ornament. The effect is largely down to the lighting, which is set behind the slatted wall surface. It creates a pattern akin to the windows on the main elevation. And it gives, again, a sense of Moro's consistency. The pattern of the windows on the main elevation reappearing in the pattern of the lighting inside. It shows us too how functional elements were exploited for effect, because these vertical slats, this paneling, is there partly for acoustic reasons, but also to conceal the surfaces. Everything is being thought about here. Function and art coexist. Time precludes saying too much more about practice's subsequent theatres, but theatres remained an important stream of work for Moro and his colleagues through the 60s and the 70s. The octagons that we saw at Birstall School appear in many of these subsequent buildings, as these examples on university campuses in Hull and Coleraine make clear. The Gulbenkian Centre at Hull of 1969 was designed as a space for the teaching of drama with a flexible studio auditorium. On the right, meanwhile, the Riverside Theatre at what was then the new University of Ulster in Coleraine of 1975 was understood as a focal point for the campus, but also a resource for the wider community. In Bristol, the practice refurbished and extended the Theatre Royal, or Old Vic as it's usually known, in 1972, converting the 18th century Cooper's Hall building, which you see there with its pediments and its pilasters, into the foyers of this theatre, adding extended foyers and a sophisticated geometric theatre studio space there on the right. There were unbuilt projects too. A large arts centre for Hounslow on the waterfront at Brentford, for example, which Moro was particularly sad to see abandoned. But the last major project did come to fruition. This was Plymouth Theatre Royal, commissioned in 1974, completed in 1982. And it encapsulates and recapitulates many of the themes we've seen this evening. Like Nottingham Playhouse or the Festival Hall, this is a major public building on a prominent site. There's a strong geometric consistency in its octagonal forms, which pervade all aspects of the building. The form of the auditoria, the form of the lift shafts, even the columns within the foyers, all of them are octagons. They just get everywhere. Technically, this was it is an ambitious building. The city council had two competing factions. One wanted a medium-sized theatre for high-quality repertory performances. The other, a large building that could take commercial touring shows. The two factions couldn't agree on how big the theatre should be. Moro and his colleagues, including Michael Head, André Blonsky, produced a design which did both. The ceiling can descend on inverted screw jacks to hide the upper gallery, creating a two-tier auditorium for those smaller performances. But when required, the button can be pressed and the ceiling rises majestically to reveal the upper level. An auditorium which feels complete and whole, regardless of which capacity is present. It doesn't have any of that sense of provisionality or ephemerality that you sometimes get in adaptable spaces. A final theatre followed in Swansea at the University College there. But by this date, 1983, the arts buildings were fading away like the council housing before. Moro retired. The practice closed. Almost all of its work, as we've seen, had been in the public sector. The political retrenchment of the 1980s made that focus on the public sector challenging. But nonetheless, as we've seen, the work of Moro and his colleagues demonstrates the opportunities available in mid-century Britain to a small creative practice working with enlightened clients. These buildings have long been recognized as being of significance. They attracted contemporary acclaim. Projects like the Festival Hall, Moro's house at Blackheath, the Nottingham Playhouse were all amongst the earliest post-war listings in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And other buildings have since been listed, including Fairlawn School, the Gulbenkian Centre, and Plymouth Theatre Royal. For me as an architectural historian, these buildings also make an important point. They are not accompanied by verbose theories or complex ideologies. They're practical. They're founded in a rigorous analysis of the brief, demonstrating control and consistency, whilst also being festive and humane, showing that modern architecture could be artistic without necessarily being ornamental. These buildings take the lessons of the 1930s and develop them through into the 1980s. For Moro, they represented the continuity of modernism in the face of postmodern challenge. They offered a statement of what good public architecture could be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alistair. I think we want to do questions, but I'm aware now that I'm sitting here in the hall, as we normally have with people coming in with their questions. For those of you out there in Zoom land, I should have mentioned perhaps putting your questions in the chat at the beginning. I apologize for not mentioning that. But perhaps to do this, should we suggest that if you've got a question out there, you get to the bit, are there sort of emojis you can put in the corner of your Zoomy picture that show you want to ask a question? Is that the way to do it? I'm saying to our technicians.
It should pop up in the chat box. And they do. And
they do. Okay. So, if any of you out there who would like to ask us, if you could do that, and meanwhile, us here in the hall could perhaps. Should I natter on a bit about how you fit in our series we've done here? I mean, the idea was that the first 4 lectures we did were pre-war people who came into England and introduced modernism. It came on. And we thought going on into the post-war period, we should try and bring to light architects who are perhaps less known than the more famous ones. And it's in that framework that we thought about having a talk on Peter Moro. And I think what you've done here is bring out really a sort of contradiction in that, or rather I'd like to ask you about the contradiction, in that he came from Germany. I don't know, when he was an assistant with Lubetkin, he clearly would have been older than the guys from, the technical guys from the AA, who were a lot younger. Whether through his age, his rigor and his intervention happened, or it was more than that.
I mean, I guess he was a contemporary with the likes of sort of Dennis Laston, for example. He was one of his great friends, and 2 of them met at Tecton and were good friends throughout. Of course, big plug there for your next Laston.
I was going to say our next post is Laston.
I mean, you know, he wasn't long out of ETH when he came straight across to London. So I mean, he was, I think, in many ways their kind of contemporary. The challenges he had were adapting to English building practice, and there are sort of great funny stories where he goes down to Harbour Meadow to look at the construction and starts trying to tell the contractors how to do things like wall ties and cavity walls, and they have to patiently explain to him that, you know, that might be how you do it in Switzerland, but over here it's a bit different. So, you know, he learns about feet and inches. He learns about how buildings are built in England as well. So it's certainly, you know, a continued learning curve for him.
Is anybody? Yes, James.
I was interested by the Illy building in Aldermot, partly because Goldfinger had built 3 buildings for Illy at St. Albans. In fact, when I was working at the buildings office, we were working on an extension to one of those buildings for Illy. So the relationship hadn't broken down. And so one was always a bit surprised that they went tomorrow to design that for the site there, especially since Goldfinger's Albemarle Street building is only 50 yards down the road there.
Yes, it's not entirely clear why Hilly chose Moro specifically for this project. I haven't come across, I mean, the archive for that project is particularly thin because of the fact that it isn't a public sector client. My assumption has always been that the connection was through Robin Day. I mean, I don't know whether Goldfinger wasn't available or didn't have the work, whether it was, whether they tried asking him and he wasn't available, or whether they just felt like a change and Robin Day said, well, I've got this very good collaboration with Peter Moro, why don't you see about him doing the building? But it's not something that the archive has particularly shed any light on.
Neil.
Alistair, thank you for the talk. You said that Peter Moro liked to use the octagon, quite a lot, and whereas I can see it has a usefulness in theatre auditoria, my experience is a very difficult thing to play with when you're trying to do other things like staircases, toilets.
Yes.
Why did he stick with this so much?
It's not entirely clear. Once they got onto the octagon, they just kept on using it. And I mean, they weren't alone in that. Harold Killick-Partridge and Amos in this same period were particularly keen on octagons. And John Partridge said to me, oh, well, octagons are great because you don't have any dead corners, which I suppose is true. But yes, as you say, there are untold other complexities in trying to make in trying to make the buildings actually work. I mean, what's interesting, I suppose, is that octagonal classrooms, for example, seem to work quite well, and certainly in terms of the kind of more informal primary school pedagogies which were emerging in the 60s, they seem quite particularly suited to that sort of thing. And a building like Plymouth Theatre Royal, which is, as I say, kind of octagon central, they really are everywhere, would have been complicated regardless of whether they'd done it. To be honest, I think they just liked the challenge, actually. I mean, I have asked Moro's colleagues about, why they stuck with it, and I think they just enjoyed it.
There were quite a lot of octagon buildings, like HKBA, as you say, but also architects go back.
Yeah, the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield, Renton Howard Wood were doing it as well around this time.
I remember we were students who thought this was an easy thing to do. It's a big mistake.
Yes.
No, it's not, is it? I mean, octagons are quite difficult.
Yes.
What are interesting are obtuse angles, obtuse angles between planes, and how that you can then do spaces that slide one into another.
Yes.
And that goes back to Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yes.
He really loved obtuse angles.
Yes.
Yes.
I just had a question. I just wondered if you could say something about Moro's reputation. It's sort of when he was alive and towards the end of his career, just latching on to your idea of, he was a sort of practical commercial architect who sort of just did the work. Was that his sort of reputation, sort of just a quiet achiever that does the work, or was he venerated?
That's a good question. I mean, he's certainly a character from what I've seen. I would say possibly not a quiet person. I mean that in the best possible way. I mean, he was certainly, I mean, within the theatre world, he was regarded as one of the best, and the sequence of projects that they got demonstrates that, and the way in which, I mean, the Arts Council would bring him in to advise them. He was a leading light in the Association of British Theatre Technicians. So he really was seen as someone that knew his theatre. So he wrote, the AJ and the AR would get him reviewing theatres around Europe and beyond, and so on. And certainly in the late 80s, when discussions began about listing post-war buildings, as I say, several of Moro's buildings were in those first listings. He was involved, I think, in the post-war steering group at English Heritage that was considering those first listings. So he was seen as a figure of some significance, even though there's, the actual body of work is not massive. And he also maintained a sort of presence even after the practice had closed. There is the archive is particularly rich in cuttings from building design and the AJ, where he sort of fire off letters regularly, typically complaining about postmodernism actually, and suggesting that everyone should be designing kind of very, enriched modern buildings without any of what he saw as these kind of silly gimmicks. And I think in his latter day Who's Who's entries, he said that his hobby was now writing rude letters to the architectural press. So, even after the practice had stopped designing buildings, he was still kind of a figure in some of these debates, absolutely. Again, there are invitations in the archive and that sort of thing where he was being invited back to universities to speak about this period and so on. So, I think definitely seen as someone important. And in fact, Neil's asked a question, but didn't Neil, he was one of your examiners, or he?
Well, I think he was.
You think he was? Yes.
I was so traumatized by that time. I'm not really very sure.
But, so I think consistently seen as someone interesting and important in the practice scene as doing interesting work, yeah.
We've got a question here from Gillian out there in Zoom land, which is, what did he think of the subsequent changes to the festival hall?
That's a good question. There's no clear record of what he thought about the refacing of the 1960s, but he certainly was dismayed by what happened in the 80s after the building was more routinely opened up during the day, and it accrued what he saw as clutter within the foyers, and that he thought all of this rather compromised the kind of clarity of the original design, because obviously much more of the interior does survive than the exterior. Towards the end of his life, he died in 1998, so he was aware of the beginnings of the Allies and Morrison plans to clear out the foyers, and he was very much supportive of those. And I dare say he would have, approved of, certainly in terms of the foyers, what happened subsequently in the early 2000s.
Thank you. I've got a yellow hand on Adrian Gale. Can Adrian?
Yes, you should.
Can he speak?
AD, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Good. Far away.
I don't have a question.
Oh, you don't have a question? Oh.
No problem.
Sorry, okay.
But what I would say,
this is the first time we've got this far, I think, with doing joint Zoom and live thing, and so far it's worked pretty well.
But is it possible that I could make a comment, which is,
yes.
There was an architect working with Peter Moro who was very much involved in the theatre at Plymouth, and has recently made some further development. And I wonder what, within the, if you like, the language that Peter Moro developed, what people have thought about the result of the work that this man did. And I'm sorry, I forget his name, but it's certainly stamped into the history of the later later office, I'm sorry.
There's a very strange echo on that. I'm not entirely sure that I quite got it.
Connection over there, but it was another question about the Royal Festival Hall.
I had some Plymouth in there as well. But...
I might have misheard it myself.
Do you want to answer on Plymouth?
I mean, what I can say about Plymouth, I will try and guess where well, now I can hear myself. This is terrifying. I know what all of you feel like. Plymouth Theatre Royal, so what can I say about it that speaks to its more recent history? It has recently been extended, and again, picking up the sort of angled geometries and so on of the original design. And certainly the initial work on that was done by Andrzej Blonsky, who had been one of the project architects in the late 70s, early 80s on that. Plymouth Theatre Royal now is not entirely as it was in 1982, but I think the extension has been done relatively sympathetically, and it's very good, of course, that they got Andrzej Blonsky back in to be involved in that, and it has been listed relatively recently as well. So it is a building of some significance. That probably doesn't answer the question at all. I'm really sorry, but the tech just didn't allow me to hear it properly.
Okay, well, are there any more?
There might be a question in the chat.
I'm trying to think.
Yes,
Emma, yes. How did, yeah, I'm going to read it, okay? How did the design of the theatres with its, okay, can you read it? I can't read it much.
How did the design shape of his theatres fit with other theatres, i.e. Chichester hexagonal, I think, on which my father worked as a structural engineer? Oh, that's a good connection. Yeah, I mean, that search for geometry and those sort of polygons that absolutely appear in a number of theatres at this time. Powell and Moyer at Chichester, we mentioned Renton Howard Wood at the Crucible, and it's not solely confined to British theatres. I mean, if you look at West German civic theatre of this period, even some in North America, those sorts of polygonal geometries, hexagonal, octagonal, absolutely come through in all of those as well. And Moro would have known all of those. I mean, he was very scathing about the possibility of looking certainly beyond the UK for inspiration. He said, oh, you know, the West German theatres are all far bigger and far better resourced, but he did tend to go and look at them. And there certainly were lessons that could be learnt from them. So yes, I mean, it fits into that sort of geometric trend that we've kind of already noted, which we see in theatres and indeed beyond them. I mean, the difference, I suppose, is that at Chichester, Powell and Moyer were creating a theatre with a thrust stage that comes out into the middle of the auditorium, and you have the seating around three sides of it. Moro's big theatres tend to be much more conventional proscenium arch theatres, or theatres that are basically confrontational with stage here, audience there. It's only the Gulbenkian Centre and the studio at Bristol Old Vic that are maybe a wee bit more flexible. I guess that one thing to say about the flexibility, though, is that certainly at Bristol, they argued that the kind of octagon gave the space a degree of character and non-directionality at the same time. So it allowed it to be flexible, but without it just being a kind of simple black box.
We have a question from Andrew Jackson. PTR, is that Plymouth or Portsmouth Theatre Royal?
Plymouth Theatre Royal.
Plymouth Royal, PTR, has a horrendously oversized new sculpture outside it these days. I don't know.
I don't think I've seen that. It's been a wee while since I was there, not surprisingly, after the last couple of years. That's just, well, I haven't seen it.
So that's Nottingham.
Yes, Nottingham, and I don't. Yes, Nottingham has a big the Sky Mirror by Anish Kapoor outside it. I quite like that because it lets you do some jaunty photographs with it, sort of reflective. But I know it's not to all tastes, and I know that certainly those of Moro's colleagues who worked on Nottingham Playhouse have regretted some of the changes made inside the building subsequent to its completion, and particularly the fact that concrete has been painted. But that said, that so the cafe I think is currently being refurbished at Nottingham Playhouse, and from what I've seen of the drawings, actually quite sympathetically. So that's good news.
Right, Andrew, yes.
Just as a general question, how has the housing survived, and is it generally cherished, or is it?
Well, yeah, I did a sort of epic walking tour of it back in 2019, and it was looking in pretty good condition. Obviously, I haven't been around and talked to residents about it, and it would indeed be interesting to know what they think. But particularly Peckham, I mean, it was beautifully kept, and the flower pots everywhere. People obviously taking a real pride in that walkway. So, and I had that sense of a lot of it, that it seemed to be working pretty well. So, it seemed to be a positive story from what I could tell.
Yes, I mean, that was a great surprise in that housing scheme.
Yes, I mean, I think it is one of, we kind of know the story of Camden, and particularly because of Mark Svennison's excellent work on Camden. But Southwark, was one of several South London boroughs that was doing really interesting work. And I think, again, some of those schemes are well known. but not all of them. And I think there's a lot more that could and should be said about these housing schemes, particularly in the 1970s, as there were these more complex layouts being explored.
Yes, so they had very large sites as well, and the smaller ones. I think there's some Naden and Anglia schemes.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. That were very, very good at that time. I think we're almost approaching the time, aren't we, for the end? As has been run already, our next talk is going to be on Dennis Lasden, which may cover some of the area, but William Curtis, I think, is going to speak to us on that, which will be a performance. And as the next one in the series will be Peter Wormersley, who moves us on a bit because he's somebody definitely who started in the post-war period, but I think is a neglected architect. And Neil, I think you can speak to us on that. We haven't got dates for that. The other thing we're trying to set up is a visit in the autumn to Milan and areas around it, if anybody's interested. Otherwise, I think we should. We've had one applause, but you deserve another applause.
Thank you
well.
very much.